For the month of October, I participated in a miniature painting contest set up by my local game store. The rules were this: pick out any miniature in the store, paint it up in less than 2 weeks, and turn it in for a chance to win the fame and glory that you can only obtain by winning a local game store painting competition. Store credit. To claim the gold during the spooky season, I chose the nastiest and the gnarliest model in the store that I could find. Grandpa Nurgle's very own Demon Maggoth Lord. Honestly, I had no idea that this model existed, and as soon as I googled it, I knew that this was gonna be the model to capture the spooky season. So, this is that adventure. This demon model has so much detail, it was almost overwhelming. In my experience, the only way to handle an overwhelming model is to dive in and don't look back. I didn't have a lot of time to paint this model, so using my airbrush was essential. First, I primed the model black to make sure I got the darkest shadows as possible. Using white ink, I painted white Xenophal, getting brighter and brighter toward the rider and the head of the beast. That's where I want most of my focus to be. I then covered the acid vomit with the white ink. Yes, this thing has acid vomit. Now it's time to start base coating the skin using various contrast paints. I started with a bright green covering most of the torso and arms. I then moved to a more sickly orange-yellow to add more variation to the skin. For lots of contrast, I painted the lower parts of the limbs a deep purple. I think this makes the model look a lot more interesting and demonesque. After looking at the model, I realized that the skin on the underside would probably be a little bit more fleshy, so I added more of the yellow-orange back to the chest. I then took that same color, mixed with a little red, and started airbrushing what I imagine are the softer parts of the body, such as the mouth and patches of sores. With that, we have an awesome base to start on our detail brushwork. Using my brightest green, I painted the entirety of the vomit. I want this stuff to look crazy coming out of the demon's mouth. Using a brown speed paint, I paint the lower base of the claws. Then with black, I cover the tip and wet blend them where they meet to get a smooth transition. Rinse and repeat for the other claws and horns. It's okay if your color transition isn't super smooth. This is a war beast after all. It's bound to have some imperfections. So just have fun with it. I didn't apply any black to the teeth because I have other plans for those. Now it's time to step away from the beast and start working on the rider. The scythe is coming next. Using a dark brown, I painted the wood on the scythe. Using that color, I decided to experiment and paint the saddle cloth the same color. The texture on the fur made this paint work wonderfully. I'm definitely going to use this fur in the future. It is called Gore Grunter fur. With skin, I usually start with a dark color and work my way up to the highlights, but I decided to try base coating with a lighter color this time. While that dried, I moved on to the scythe, base coating the metal with an iron metallic paint. You can see that little Nurgling in the background I used to experiment with skin colors. It didn't go so well, but that's why we experiment. Every failed experiment is XP earned. That color worked so well on the scythe, I went ahead and used it on the armor. Using a bronze gold, I painted those dome parts of Nurgle's symbol, along with the rider's chainmail. Because this is a bad guy, I figured his leather skirt would be made of some sort of flesh, so I used Gilliman flesh to coat the skirt, and it turned out great. Using that same brown we used on the beast horns, I painted the horns on the rider. I realized that I forgot to paint the wraps on the scythe, so I quickly painted that up with some skeleton horde. Time to shade the skin using Reikland Flesh Shade. I made sure that it gets into all those recesses, but I'd take extra time to make sure that it isn't pooling everywhere. Now we let it dry. Using pink, I added some highlights and texture to the opening of the beast's mouth. Using Lamian Medium and Drakenhof Nightshade, I made a 50-50 glaze for the armor. The dark blue makes a great shade without desaturating the metal color with a black shade. I base coated the skulls using Citadel Wraithbone. Next, I used Averland Sunset to pick out those boils on the skin. Yellow's a tricky color, so be sure to use multiple thin layers to get a smooth result. Now that those boils are picked out, this beast has twice the detail I had before. I could leave it as is, but I know that I can do better, and I've got the time to do it. Using a red shade, I picked out the gizzard to add some more gory red. I used a bright pink to highlight the random veins and bumps along the arms and legs. Using this blood red paint, I decided to paint the saliva and some of the teeth. The more I paint this model, the more I love it. So let's add some more highlights. This time I'm going to add some green on the tiny boils that are big enough to be noticeable, but not big enough to be that sickly yellow color. Time to highlight the hooves, horns, and teeth. Nothing too crazy, just some edge highlights. The final highlight is done with ivory. To give the armor a little extra punch, I added silver, like I was painting a non-metallic metal, painting the areas where the light would be hitting the model. Next, I choose the same base color of the skin to do some highlights. That shade knocked that color way down, and I'm going to have to bring it back up a bit with some bold strokes. Adding some off-white while I push the highlights even farther. To mix things up, I'm going to add some fuchsia texture to this tentacle thing. While the color's still on my brush, I might as well add some to the brand on the rider's chest. With the skin good enough, it's time to highlight those other horns. Using pure white, I pick out the eyes. Now we can make them look nice and demonish with some bright green highlights. Mixing some of my tans and greens together, I found a cool color for the bands holding the skulls to the large horn. Time to glue the scythe to the rider. That is looking sick, but I think I could still do better. This scythe handle needed to look more like wood, so I added some lines down the length of the handle to look like the grain of the wood. Now we add the vomit. I didn't catch it on camera, but I added some thinned down yellows and oranges to the vomit to give it a little more texture, make it a little nasty. And there it is in all of its nasty glory. Time to make the base. I'm going to start with the almighty cork board. After messing with the cork for a bit, I figured out that I wanted to do an inclined slope so that the vomit was pointing more upward and not straight down into the ground. Once that was decided, I got to hot gluing the cork into place. I marked where I wanted the model to sit and trimmed the cork down a bit. When it comes to complicated bases, don't be the person who forgets to mark where the model fits best. You'll thank me later. Next, I added some earth texture to bring it all together. As the texture was drying, I threw some rocks in there to spice it up. This is where I tried something that I've never tried before, UV resin. When I was looking for inspiration on how to paint this model, I came across some artwork that was awesome. This beast is spewing acid all over the battlefield, so it's gotta be on the base, right? What better material to make a nasty ooze stuff than UV resin. So I started little by little, adding a little stream to the base. Now what if the ooze was dripping over the edge? Fishing line? Awesome. I want to make sure this ooze is vibrant, so after I prime the base, I highlight with white ink. Now to put some serious contrast in this base, blue shadows and red highlights. Time to paint the ooze. I applied Agrax Earthshade to the base. I then highlighted the base to bring out the texture further. To make the base pop a little more, I added some grass and bush textures. Every model base deserves a crisp black border. The slime was looking a bit flat to me, so I applied some gloss varnish to make it look nice and nasty. Before we can add this model to the base, we need to add some glowing effects to those demonic brands on the beast. Using thinned down paint, I highlighted all the parts I wanted to glow. Then, using the airbrush, I traced over those lines to create the glowing area of effect. Using red, I airbrush over the white to get that initial deep glowing color. Next, I punch it up with the orange. I fill the brands with pure white again to make that brand extra bright. Then I repeat the previous step with my brush, getting brighter with my colors. I imagine that the scythe is not a well-maintained weapon. I mean, this is a Prince of Nurgle, after all, and being the god of rot and decay, a Prince of Nurgle would have a rusty and worn-down weapon that strikes tetanus into the hearts of his enemies. To get that rusty effect, we need to start with the dark brown and sponge onto the iron. Now for the rusty orange, sponge that in the same areas. Now make some silver highlights on the edges. Just because the weapon is rusty doesn't mean it isn't used. The edges of the weapon are likely to be worn down, showing the clean metal underneath. Some finishing touches were made on these last blisters. Now it's time to put this sucker on its base. Believe it or not, I am super proud of this model. I got to try a lot of techniques that I've never tried before. I got to push my limits with different things like the UV resin and with airbrushing, especially blending all these different colors together, making new color schemes. It was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed this project. I finished this model the night before the due date, so I had to rush this to the game store the next day. And I'm happy to report that after a few weeks of being judged by the people who own the store and the customers who walked in, that I came home with first prize. So, kind of a big deal. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to win, but darn it if it isn't awesome to know that others think that what you're doing is cool too. If you made it to the end of this long video, I want to thank you. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and go paint your minions.